You click to witness the most barbaric execution France ever staged. But what if I told you the method wasn't just about killing the body, it was engineered to destroy the soul? The winter of 1757 crept over Paris like a suffocating mist, gray skies pressing down on narrow alleys, breath visible in the chilled morning air, and a city muttering secrets beneath its frostbitten breath. France was uneasy. Whispers of corruption, food riots, and unholy taxes twisted through the taverns like smoke. The monarchy sat fat and insulated in Versailles, golden halls glowing with firelight, while common men froze on cobblestone streets. In this growing chasm, one man, pale, gaunt, twitching at the corners of his mind, prepared to do something no one else dared. Robert Francois Damiens was not a revolutionary. Not yet. He was a failed servant, dismissed from his post for erratic behavior, his mind frayed from religious guilt, paranoia, and rejection. He spoke in circles. He wandered the city's edges, muttering about sin and salvation. But beneath the madness lived clarity. France was rotting, and no one in power would ever hear the cries of the dying poor unless he forced them to listen. He never intended to kill the king. That part was always misunderstood or purposefully twisted. What Damiens wanted was attention, a message, a moment of divine terror that might shake the pillars of power. But the only language kings understand is violence. And on the icy evening of January 5th, 1757, violence spoke loud and clear. Outside the palace of Versailles, amid the crunching of frost and the clip of noblemen's boots, Damiens waited in silence. He wasn't hiding. He simply blended into the cold, a man too ordinary to fear. When Louis XV stepped into view, draped in velvet and followed by attendants, Damiens lunged, a flash of steel, one thrust. The blade slipped beneath the king's ribs, slicing nothing vital. A shallow wound. Blood bloomed. Yes, but the king did not fall. For a moment, everyone froze, and then chaos erupted. Guards seized Damiens instantly. He did not resist. "Forgive me," he whispered, his breath visible in the cold. "I did not mean to kill." But it didn't matter. The court didn't hear his repentance. The press didn't care for nuance. The crown needed a villain, and Damiens had handed himself to them with trembling hands and blood on his coat. They beat him on the spot, fists crashing down like hammers on wet meat. By the time he reached his prison cell, his jaw had shattered, and his nose had caved inward. But the worst was yet to come. Behind palace doors, Louis survived. He clutched his side and moaned for the Virgin Mary, but physicians declared the wound superficial. The king would recover. But Damiens, he had just become the most hated man in France. He would be stripped not only of his rights but of his humanity. There would be no quiet execution, no swift beheading, no mercy, because he had done the unthinkable, touched the divine. La main du roi, the hand of the king, had been stained by common blood, and for that France would stage a spectacle. They would not simply kill him, they would unmake him, piece by agonizing piece. Inside the Bastille, he sat alone in a cell soaked in urine and rot. No blankets, no candle. The iron door creaked like a beast, exhaling each time the guards passed. He prayed, but no prayers came, only the sound of scratching, somewhere beyond the wall, or maybe inside his own head. And yet, Damiens spoke little. He asked for wine, he asked to see his daughter, but mostly he stared, unblinking, like he'd already seen what was coming. He may have hoped for a trial, but what he got was something far older, a ritual, cold, orchestrated, bloodthirsty, because while the king lived, Damiens would soon envy the dead. They never called it a trial, not really. It wore the robes of justice, but the air around it reeked of ritual, not reason. The gavel was silence, the defense, fear, and the verdict had already been written in blood the moment Robert Francois Damiens touched the king's flesh. He was dragged from the Bastille days after the stabbing, blindfolded, teeth broken, shackled in rusted chains that had sliced his wrists to the bone. The people who watched him pass did not see a man. They saw a ghost, a traitor, a devil dressed in skin. Mothers turned their children's eyes away. Soldiers spat at his feet. The press called him the regicide, though Louis XV still lived. But what mattered wasn't truth, it was the theater. And in this act, Damiens was already sentenced. The court convened in the shadow of Notre Dame, under the stained glass and cold stares of stone saints. Not a single advocate dared speak for him. Lawyers who might have defended him backed away, citing illness, family matters, anything to avoid the wrath of the crown. To represent Damiens was to align with blasphemy and perhaps face a similar fate. So he sat alone on the wooden bench, hands trembling, body twitching, face a patchwork of bruises and dried blood. Interrogation was not inquiry, it was torment. First came the questions, shouted in Latin, French and venom. Then came the beatings, fists, boots, the flat side of swords, and when words failed to please the magistrates, they turned to flame. His legs were pressed between boards, shins splintered by wedges hammered inward. They called it the question, but it was not seeking answers, it was enforcing obedience. His screams echoed off stone walls like prayers no god dared answer. They heated irons in silence, watched the metal glow, then pressed it against his thighs. The stench of burning flesh filled the chamber like incense. What were your accomplices' names? I acted alone. Whip. Who sent you? No one. Iron. Do you repent? I meant no murder. More heat, more silence, more screams. By the fourth day his flesh had blistered like wax. His eyes fluttered shut between each blow. His mind, once tangled in guilt and delusion, now unraveled completely. He began to whisper to himself. Not prayers, not curses, just fragments. It was cold that night. The knife was dull. I didn't mean to. They starved him. They isolated him. No sunlight, no warmth, no human contact except the hands that hurt him. He began to hallucinate. Sometimes he'd see his daughter in the corner of the cell, pale, weeping, whispering psalms she'd never learned. Other times he saw the king, naked and bleeding, weeping just as he had. The guards mocked him, called him the Antichrist, poked at his bruises, poured vinegar into his wounds, laughed when he flinched. One scrawled the word vermin across his cell in blood. Another whispered, "You'll be torn apart like meat, but slowly, you'll see." They weren't joking. The plan was already in motion. The court decreed that he would suffer the punishment reserved for regicides, a phrase so rare, so sacred to royal vengeance, that no one alive had seen it carried out. It called not for death but for dissection, quartering, but only after the flesh was broken open. The sentence was read aloud in court, not once but 3 times, as if repeating it could make it feel just. His flesh shall be torn with red-hot pincers, molten lead, boiling oil, and burning resin shall be poured into the wounds. Then his limbs shall be drawn and quartered by 4 horses until his body be dismembered. The crowd outside cheered, or perhaps they gasped, or maybe both. Word spread like fire. Paris would see a death that hadn't been performed in centuries. Not just an execution, a spectacle, a sermon in screams, and everyone was invited. Posters were printed, streets were cleared. The date was chosen, March 28th. From that moment, Damiens was no longer a man. He was material, a sacrifice prepared. Locked in darkness, fed only enough to keep him breathing. They shaved his body, scrubbed it raw, branded him one last time. A mark above the heart, not a symbol of guilt, but of ownership. The monarchy had made its point. This was not about a wounded king, it was about divine punishment. And in France in 1757, divine punishment had teeth, because they didn't want justice. They wanted vengeance, and every French citizen to watch it happen. The scaffold began rising before the sun. Dozens of laborers, under armed watch, dragged timbers through the slush-clogged streets of Paris and erected the platform plank by plank in the heart of Place de Grève. It groaned under its own weight, nailed and reinforced like a siege engine, not just to support a man, but to hold him down as he was torn apart. The streets thickened with bodies by dawn, men with frozen breath and greedy eyes, women clutching handkerchiefs already damp with fear, children held on shoulders, too young to know what they were about to witness. This wasn't an execution, it was a ritual designed to sear itself into the nation's memory. In a nearby smithy, iron hissed red in the coals, hooks, chains, pincers the size of a butcher's hand. They were cleaned meticulously, not out of mercy but ceremony. Another fire crackled beside it, boiling a cauldron of oil and pitch and molten lead. The air stank of ash and metal, but that wasn't the worst scent. No, the worst was the waiting. Paris didn't just want death, it wanted to savor it. And still Damiens lived. They dragged his body from the dungeon the morning of March 28th. What emerged was not the same man who had stabbed the king. His hair had fallen out in clumps. His skin hung loose, blistered, half sloughed from weeks of rot and fire. His lips were split from dehydration, his eyes wild and unfocused. He muttered something, a prayer perhaps, or madness. When he saw the scaffold, he vomited on himself. His knees buckled. He was carried the rest of the way. Ropes bound him spread eagle against a frame. The cold sliced him deeper than any knife. The priests began chanting. The crowd fell into a hush so complete it seemed the city had forgotten how to breathe. Then the executioner stepped forward with the pincers. They began at the legs. A twist, a yank, flesh tore in ribbons. The iron bit into thigh and calf, pulling skin away from muscle with sickening sound, like fabric tearing underwater. Blood sprayed in arcs across the wood, steam rising into the air. Damien screamed, a sound so raw, so inhuman, it silenced even the most bloodthirsty among them. Next came the hot oil. Executioners poured it into his open wounds, along with molten lead and burning resin. His flesh hissed and blackened. Chunks of him began to slough off entirely, revealing white bone beneath, and still, he did not die. The crowd began to turn. Some cheered, of course, those who came for a show, but others began to cry. Some collapsed. A few vomited into the snow-melted gutters. One man reportedly clawed at his own eyes and fled the square. Then came the branding. Crosses burned into his shoulders. A red-hot bar pressed to his chest until the skin bubbled and burst. He began to seize, twitching violently, mouth foaming, but his eyes remained open, wide, seeing, feeling. The horses were brought out next. 4 of them, white, symbolic, imperial. They snorted and pawed at the cobblestones, steam rising off their backs. Chains were fastened to each of his limbs, wrists and ankles stretched taut, muscles trembling like taut rope. The command was given. The whip cracked. The horses pulled, but the body did not yield. Damien screamed again, a sound now hoarse and wet, like lungs drowning in their own fire. The executioners cursed. Blood burst from every joint, but the limbs stayed on. It was too soon. The body was not broken enough. The executioners sharpened their blades and approached. They began slicing into the joints, hacking through sinew and tendon, exposing bone. They dug their knives in, creating artificial tears where nature had resisted. It took nearly an hour of cutting, pulling, tightening, loosening, and all while he lived. By the time the legs came off, his body looked more like a butchered animal than a man. Finally, the arms followed. With one final crack of the whip, the horses surged forward and ripped what remained of Robert Francois Damiens into pieces. Still, it wasn't over. His mangled torso, still twitching, was placed atop a fire built on the scaffold itself. They burned what was left. Flesh, bone, soul, all turned to ash, and through it all the crowd remained. Some clapped, some fainted, others simply stared, numb. The children had stopped crying. The birds had stopped singing. The city for a moment felt like it had fallen under a spell of silence, a moment of awe so grotesque it bordered on the sacred. They thought it would end there, but something strange happened in that silence. No one celebrated, no one sang, because in the center of the square where a man had once stood was nothing but a smear of blood and bone, and the question no one dared speak aloud began to fester. What had they just watched, and why did they feel unclean? The air was still heavy with smoke and blood when the horses were brought back, their flanks lathered in sweat, white coats streaked with crimson, the executioners bare-chested, red-faced, their hands shaking not from pity but exhaustion, prepared for the final act. Robert Francois Damiens, or what remained of him, was no longer a man but a tattered ruin, a monument to state vengeance. His limbs had been torn off in pieces, hacked free with blades when nature refused to yield to chains, and now the mutilated trunk, flesh hanging like curtains, ribs exposed like warped scaffolding, was hoisted toward the fire. This wasn't punishment. It was purification by flame. The priests resumed their chanting, louder now, as if to drown out the growing unease in the crowd. This was supposed to be justice, and yet no one could look away from the abomination it had become. Children wept in silence. Mothers covered their faces, but the square was still packed, shoulder to shoulder, thousands strong, drawn to the horror like moths to a funeral pyre. The fire caught quickly. Straw, pitch, and flesh fused in the heat, producing a sickly stench that curled through the city like a ghost. Bits of fat crackled like candle wax. Muscles spasmed involuntarily, death twitches mistaken for agony, or perhaps something worse. Damiens, they said, remained alive long after his arms and legs had been removed, long after the lead had entered his bones, long after he should have slipped into nothingness. What if he still lingered now, somewhere in the smoke, watching, listening, and then silence. No scream, no sermon, just the hiss of burning marrow and the rustle of the wind through the hushed crowd. It was over, or so they thought, because what followed wasn't closure but sickness. The spectators began to disperse like survivors of a battle they hadn't meant to fight. One by one they stumbled away, not with triumph but with trembling hands and sunken eyes. Some whispered prayers, others didn't speak at all. A woman collapsed near the scaffold and was dragged away, her shoes soaked in blood. A man was later found behind the cathedral, retching and sobbing, convinced he had seen the devil walk among them. The ashes were gathered in silence. Every piece of bone, every tooth, every flake of skin. It was forbidden to keep souvenirs, though some surely did. The remains were taken outside the city and cast into the Seine, as if even the earth itself had refused to hold him. No grave, no marker, no memory except the one seared into the minds of those who watched him die. But the damage had already been done. In trying to erase a man, they had carved a wound into the soul of France. The nobles had expected a performance, a cleansing, but what they received was something darker, an echo they couldn't silence. For weeks afterward, pamphlets circulated describing the scene in gruesome detail. Artists drew it, writers described it, children reenacted it in the streets, and beneath it all a question twisted like a blade. What does it say about us, that we cheered? The king himself, once healed from his minor wound, reportedly turned pale when the full account of the execution was read aloud to him. Some said he regretted it. Others whispered that he didn't regret it enough, that he had wanted Damien's death to make a point so sharp it would pierce through generations, and it did, but not in the way he intended. Because in killing Damien so violently, so theatrically, the monarchy had exposed something it had never meant to: fear. Fear that a single stab from a disgruntled servant could shake a throne. Fear that if one man could do it, others might follow. So they turned his body into a symbol. But symbols have a strange way of shifting shape in memory. Damien's, meant to be erased, became a ghost, a warning, not just of what happens when you defy kings, but of what happens when kings defy humanity. The church called it righteous. The state called it order. The people eventually called it madness. And slowly that madness began to rot the foundations of the world that had demanded it. Not immediately, not with a shout, but a whisper. A century later, the scaffold would return, but this time for the monarchy, and the crowds would gather again, this time to cheer as a king was torn down in kind. In the square where Damien's died, new blood would spill, but no one would forget who bled first, and what was done to him, in the name of power. Long after the fire died, and the square was scrubbed clean, France remained haunted, not by Damien's the assassin, but by Damien's the victim. His execution did not fade with time. It echoed, in pamphlets, in nightmares, in whispered confessions. Philosophers like Voltaire and Diderot would speak of it not as justice, but as proof of the monarchy's sickness. A death too grotesque to forget, a spectacle too human to forgive. Ordinary citizens, once silent, began to murmur, if this is what they do to one man, what might they do to all of us? The very tools of his death, the pincers, the branding irons, the ropes, became symbols not of safety but of tyranny. The monarchy had shown the people how it ruled, not through reverence but through terror. And when the revolution finally came, it came with the memory of Damien stitched into every slogan, every guillotine blade, every cry of liberté. Because Damien's wasn't just executed, he was made into a message. But the message didn't land the way the king had hoped. They had tried to burn rebellion out of France, but in doing so they only fanned the flame. His death became the proof that justice could be cruel, and that cruelty wears many crowns. In the end, they made an example of a man, but also revealed something monstrous in themselves. And centuries later, we still look back, not in honor, not in pride, but in horror, and we ask ourselves, was that justice, or just madness in a powdered wig?